in memory of Edith Moore, presented by Carolyn and Jimmy Dolan. In memory of Wanda Wright and Emily Wright Horn and Edith Moore, presented by Ben, Leanne, and Emma Wright. In honor of Larry and Trudy Stacy, and in memory of Randall Stacy, Anita, and Tony Stacy, presented by Auda and Rhonda Wilson. In honor of Thomas and Nora Jernigan, Titus, Atticus, Eleanor Payne, Kaylee, Olivia, and Savannah Wilson, Victoria Wilson, AC, and Wade Wilson, and in memory of H.T. Bill and Sally Jernigan, and Judy and Beatrice Billings, presented by Audie and Rhonda Wilson. In memory of L.O. and Sybil Wilson, presented by Chris, Lori, Anna Kate, and Cooper Crenshaw. In memory of Leroy Pearson, James L., and Margie Green, presented by Van and Sheila Pearson. In memory of Charles Kinsey, Van Kinsey, and the Mangum family, presented by Betty Kinsey. Presented by Tanya and Mark Horton, in memory of Estelle and John Vaughn. In memory of Evie and Edward Law and David Browning, presented by Joyce Browning. In memory of Brother Edward Barnes and Brother Sidney McLeod, presented by Betty McLeod. In memory of Jack Williams, Floyd, and Corrine Brassfield, presented by Betty Williams. In memory of Jack Williams, L.M., and Mama Lottie Mangum, presented by Alan Williams and family. In memory of Bessie Mitchell, Peggy Mitchell Bates, Bonnie Mitchell Tate, and Bill Tate, presented by James and Doris Mitchell. In memory of Jimmy Kennedy, Stephen Kennedy, Sybil Wilson, and L.O. Wilson, presented by Tony and Felisa Dill. in honor of Clytie Mitchell, and in memory of Everett Mitchell, Betty Mitchell, and Nancy Swift, presented by Dennis Mitchell. In memory of Raymond and Ruby Parham and Lucille Goforth, presented by Jimmy and Mary Ann Parham. In memory of Harold and Nell Johnston, presented by Sarah Morgan. In memory of Troy Nivens, presented by Faye Nivens. In memory of Thomas and William May Bullard, John Sharp, and Ollie Bell Parham, Thomas Lee Bullard, presented by Martha Brown. In memory of Bill McCrary and Elgie and Rubel Pickle and Elsie Lewis and Elton Pickle, presented by Mavis McCrary and Mabel Chambers. In memory of Leanne Knatzer, presented by Jared, Sidney, and Judy Knatzer. In memory of Leroy Pearson and Ellie and Ella Vaughn, presented by Sarah Pearson. In memory of John C. Robinson Sr., Virginia Robinson, Anna Carol Robinson, Cassie Sizemore, Donna Neal, and James Cantrell, presented by John C. Robinson Jr. In memory of W.C. Gerald Pearson and Gerald Pearson, B.T. and Laureen Cheek, and Janet Carter, presented by Lloyd, Charlotte Pearson, and families. In memory of Leroy Pearson, Jonna and Liana Lewis, presented by Sammy and Sherry Lewis. In memory of Jesse and Marie Johnson, Gerald Johnson, Wanda Jones, Kenneth Johnson, and David Johnson, presented by Gary and Deborah Johnson. In memory of James Need Anderson and Joan Ritter, presented by Joyce Head. In memory of Kelly Humphreys, presented by David and Brenda Dole. In memory of Conan Merlin and Michael Doyle, presented by David and Brenda Dole. In memory of Kenneth Benton, Jewel Benton, Hoyle Smith, Jean Smith, and Evelyn Fritsch, presented by Joe and Janice Benton. in honor of Duddy Williams and in memory of Jack Williams, Dean and Chrissy Sorelli. In memory of James and Lila King, Tommy and Wayne King, presented by George and Sunder King. In memory of Aaron and Lucy Vaughn, Derek King, and in honor of our children, grandchildren, and Audie, presented by George and Sunder King. Presented by Hazel Jones, in memory of Joe Irvin and William Jones, Lana Mae Lucas, and Preston Lucas. In memory of Jack Williams and Ollie and Poinsettia Williams. In memory of Dan Tubb and servicemen who did not make it home, and in honor of the families of fallen soldiers, all presented by Richard Williams and family. In memory of Aaron and Lucy Vaughn, Paul Sizemore, Michael Young, and Derek King, and in honor of Violet Sizemore, presented by Rick and Monda Sizemore. In memory of Aaron and Lucy Vaughn, Derek King, presented by Phil and Pam Adair. In memory of Harry and Sarah Adair, presented by Phil and Pam Adair.